Here, the caution from one man, Slackbridge, why or over hetter in tea, why or a gone too fast. But these were pygmies against an army. The General Assemblage subscribed to the Gospel according to Slackbridge, and gave 3 cheers for him, as he sat demonstratively panting at them. These men and women were yet in the streets, passing quietly to their homes, when Cissy, who had been called away from Louisa some minutes before, returned. "Who is it?" asked Louisa. "It is Mr. Bounderby," said Cissy, timid of the name, "and your brother Mr. Tom, and a young woman who says her name is Rachel, and that you know her." "What do they want, Cissy dear?" "They want to see you. Rachel has been crying, and seems angry." "Father," said Louisa, for he was present, "I cannot refuse to see them, for a reason that will explain itself. Shall they come in here?" As he answered in the affirmative, Cissy went away to bring them. She reappeared with them directly. Tom was last, and remained standing in the obscurest part of the room, near the door. "Mrs. Bounderby," said her husband, entering with a cool nod, "I don't disturb you, I hope. This is an unseasonable hour, but here is a young woman who has been making statements which render my visit necessary. Tom Gradgrind, as your son, young Tom, refuses for some obstinate reason or other to say anything at all about those statements, good or bad. I am obliged to confront her with your daughter." "You have seen me once before, young lady," said Rachel, standing in front of Louisa. Tom coughed. "You have seen me, young lady," repeated Rachel, as she did not answer, "once before." Tom coughed again. "I have." Rachel cast her eyes proudly towards Mr. Bounderby, and said, "Will you make it known, young lady, where, and who was there?" "I went to the house where Stephen Blackpool lodged, on the night of his discharge from his work, and I saw you there. He was there too, and an old woman who did not speak, and whom I could scarcely see, stood in a dark corner. My brother was with me." "Why couldn't you say so, young Tom?" demanded Bounderby. "I promised my sister I wouldn't." Which Louisa hastily confirmed. "And besides," said the whelp bitterly, "she tells her own story so precious well, and so full, that what business had I to take it out of her mouth?" "Say, young lady, if you please," pursued Rachel, "why, in an evil hour, you ever came to Stephen's that night." "I felt compassion for him," said Louisa, her color deepening, "and I wished to know what he was going to do, and wished to offer him assistance." "Thank you," said Bounderby. "Much flattered and obliged." "Did you offer him," asked Rachel, "a banknote?" "Yes, but he refused it, and would only take £2 in gold." Rachel cast her eyes towards Mr. Bounderby again. "Oh, certainly," said Bounderby. "If you put the question whether your ridiculous and improbable account was true or not, I am bound to say it's confirmed." "Young lady," said Rachel, "Stephen Blackpool is now named as a thief in public print all over this town, and where else? There have been a meeting tonight where he have been spoken of in the same shameful way. Stephen, the honestest lad, the truest lad, the best. Her indignation failed her, and she broke off sobbing. "I am very, very sorry," said Louisa. "Oh, young lady," returned Rachel, "I hope you may be, but I don't know. I can't say what you may ha' done. The like of you don't know us, don't care for us, don't belong to us. I am not sure why you may ha' come that night. I can't tell but what you may ha' come wi' some aim of your own, not mindin' to what trouble you brought such as the poor lad. I said then, bless you for coming, and I said it of my heart, you seemed to take so pitifully to him, but I don't know now, I don't know." Louisa could not reproach her for her unjust suspicions, she was so faithful to her idea of the man, and so afflicted. "And when I think," said Rachel through her sobs, "that the poor lad was so grateful, thinking you so good to him, when I mind that he put his hand over his hard workin' face to hide the tears that you brought up there, oh, I hope you may be sorry, and ha' no bad cause to be it, but I don't know, I don't know." "You're a pretty article," growled the whelp, moving uneasily in his dark corner, "to come here with these precious imputations. You ought to be bundled out for not knowing how to behave yourself, and you would be by rights." She said nothing in reply, and her low weeping was the only sound that was heard, until Mr. Bounderby spoke. "Come," said he, "you know what you have engaged to do. You had better give your mind to that, not this." "'Deed, I am loath," returned Rachel, drying her eyes, "that any here should see me like this, but I won't be seen so again. Young lady, when I had read what's put in print of Stephen, and what has just as much truth in it as if it had been put in print of you, I went straight to the bank to say I knew where Stephen was, and to give a sure and certain promise that he should be here in 2 days. I couldn't meet wi' Mr. Bounderby then, and your brother sent me away, and I tried to find you, but you was not to be found, and I went back to work. Soon as I come out of the mill tonight, I hastened to hear what was said of Stephen, for I know wi' pride he will come back to shame it, and then I went again to seek Mr. Bounderby, and I found him, and I told him every word I knew, and he believed no word I said, and brought me here." "So far, that's true enough," assented Mr. Bounderby, with his hands in his pockets and his hat on. "But I have known you people before today, you'll observe, and I know you never die for want of talking. Now, I recommend you not so much to mind talking just now, as doing. You have undertaken to do something, all I remark upon that at present is, do it. I have written to Stephen by the post that went out this afternoon, as I have written to him once before sin he went away," said Rachel, "and he will be here, at furthest, in 2 days. Then, I'll tell you something." "You are not aware perhaps," retorted Mr. Bounderby, "that you yourself have been looked after now and then, not being considered quite free from suspicion in this business, on account of most people being judged according to the company they keep. The post office hasn't been forgotten either. What I'll tell you is, that no letter to Stephen Blackpool has ever got into it. Therefore, what has become of yours, I leave you to guess. Perhaps you're mistaken, and never wrote any. He hadn't been gone from here, young lady, said Rachel, turning appealingly to Louisa, as much as a week, when he sent me the only letter I have had from him, saying that he was forced to seek work in another name. Oh, by George, cried Bounderby, shaking his head, with a whistle, he changes his name, does he? That's rather unlucky, too, for such an immaculate chap. It's considered a little suspicious in courts of justice, I believe, when an innocent happens to have many names. What, said Rachel, with the tears in her eyes again, what, young lady, in the name of mercy, was left the poor lad to do? The masters against him on one hand, the men against him on the other, he only wanting to work hard in peace, and do what he felt right. Can a man have no soul of his own, no mind of his own? Must he go wrong all through with this side, or must he go wrong all through with that, or else be hunted like a hare? Indeed, I pity him from my heart, returned Louisa, and I hope that he will clear himself. You need have no fear of that, young lady. He is sure. All the surer, I suppose, said Mr. Bounderby, for your refusing to tell where he is. He shall not, through any act of mine, come back with the unmerited reproach of being brought back. He shall come back of his own accord to clear himself, and put all those that have injured his good character, and he not here for its defense, to shame. I have told him what has been done against him, said Rachel, throwing off all distrust as a rock throws off the sea, and he will be here, at furthest, in 2 days. Notwithstanding which, added Mr. Bounderby, if he can be laid hold of any sooner, he shall have an earlier opportunity of clearing himself. As to you, I have nothing against you. What you came and told me turns out to be true, and I have given you the means of proving it to be true, and there's an end of it. I wish you good night all. I must be off to look a little further into this. Tom came out of his corner when Mr. Bounderby moved with him, kept close to him, and went away with him. The only parting salutation of which he delivered himself was a sulky good night, father. With a brief speech, and a scowl at his sister, he left the house. Since his sheet anchor had come home, Mr. Gradgrind had been sparing of speech. He still sat silent, when Louisa mildly said, Rachel, you will not distrust me one day, when you know me better. It goes against me, Rachel answered, in a gentler manner, to mistrust anyone, but when I am so mistrusted, when we all are, I cannot keep such things quite out of my mind. I ask your pardon for having done you an injury. I don't think what I said now. Yet I might come to think it again, with the poor lad so wronged. Did you tell him in your letter, inquired Sissy, that suspicion seemed to have fallen upon him, because he had been seen about the bank at night? He would then know what he would have to explain on coming back, and would be ready. Yes, dear, she returned, but I can't guess what can have ever taken him there. He never used to go there. It was never in his way. His way was the same as mine, and not near it. Sissy had already been at her side asking her where she lived, and whether she might come tomorrow night, to inquire if there were news of him. "I doubt," said Rachel, "if he can be here till next day." "Then I will come next night too," said Sissy. When Rachel, assenting to this, was gone, Mr. Gradgrind lifted up his head, and said to his daughter, "Louisa, my dear, I have never, that I know of, seen this man. Do you believe him to be implicated?" "I think I have believed it, father, though with great difficulty. I do not believe it now." "That is to say, you once persuaded yourself to believe it, from knowing him to be suspected. His appearance and manner, are they so honest?" "Very honest." "And her confidence not to be shaken?" "I ask myself," said Mr. Gradgrind, musing, "does the real culprit know of these accusations? Where is he? Who is he?" His hair had latterly begun to change its color. As he leaned upon his hand again, looking grey and old, Louisa, with a face of fear and pity, hurriedly went over to him, and sat close at his side. Her eyes by accident met Sissy's at the moment. Sissy flushed and started, and Louisa put her finger on her lip. Next night, when Sissy returned home and told Louisa that Stephen was not come, she told it in a whisper. Next night again, when she came home with the same account, and added that he had not been heard of, she spoke in the same low frightened tone. From the moment of that interchange of looks, they never uttered his name, or any reference to him, aloud, nor ever pursued the subject of the robbery, when Mr. Gradgrind spoke of it. The 2 appointed days ran out, 3 days and nights ran out, and Stephen Blackpool was not come, and remained unheard of. On the 4th day, Rachel, with unabated confidence, but considering her dispatch to have miscarried, went up to the bank, and showed her letter from him with his address, at a working colony, one of many, not upon the main road, 60 miles away. Messengers were sent to that place, and the whole town looked for Stephen to be brought in next day. During this whole time the whelp moved about with Mr. Bounderby like his shadow, assisting in all the proceedings. He was greatly excited, horribly fevered, bit his nails down to the quick, spoke in a hard rattling voice, and with lips that were black and burnt up. At the hour when the suspected man was looked for, the whelp was at the station, offering to wager that he had made off before the arrival of those who were sent in quest of him, and that he would not appear. The whelp was right. The messengers returned alone. Rachel's letter had gone, Rachel's letter had been delivered. Stephen Blackpool had decamped in that same hour, and no soul knew more of him. The only doubt in Cokertown was, whether Rachel had written in good faith, believing that he really would come back, or warning him to fly. On this point opinion was divided. 6 days, 7 days, far on into another week. The wretched whelp plucked up a ghastly courage, and began to grow defiant. Was the suspected fellow the thief? A pretty question. If not, where was the man, and why did he not come back? Where was the man, and why did he not come back? In the dead of night the echoes of his own words, which had rolled heaven knows how far away in the daytime, came back instead, and abided by him until morning. Chapter V found day and night again, day and night again. No Stephen Blackpool. Where was the man, and why did he not come back? Every night, Sissy went to Rachel's lodging, and sat with her in her small neat room. All day, Rachel toiled as such people must toil, whatever their anxieties. The smoke serpents were indifferent who was lost or found, who turned out bad or good. The melancholy mad elephants, like the hard-fact men, abated nothing of their set routine, whatever happened. Day and night again, day and night again. The monotony was unbroken. Even Stephen Blackpool's disappearance was falling into the general way, and becoming as monotonous a wonder as any piece of machinery in Cokertown. "I misdoubt," said Rachel, "if there is as many as 20 left in all this place, who have any trust in the poor dear lad now." She said it to Sissy, as they sat in her lodging, lighted only by the lamp at the street corner. Sissy had come there when it was already dark, to await her return from work, and they had since sat at the window where Rachel had found her, wanting no brighter light to shine on their sorrowful talk. "If it hadn't been mercifully brought about, that I was to have you to speak to," pursued Rachel, "times are, when I think my mind would not have kept right. But I get hope and strength through you, and you believe that though appearances may rise against him, he will be proved clear." "I do believe so," returned Sissy, "with my whole heart. I feel so certain, Rachel, that the confidence you hold in yours against all discouragement, is not like to be wrong, that I have no more doubt of him than if I had known him through as many years of trial as you have." "And I, my dear," said Rachel, with a tremble in her voice, "have known him through them all, to be, according to his quiet ways, so faithful to everything honest and good, that if he was never to be heard of more, and I was to live to be 100 years old, I could say with my last breath, God knows my heart. I have never once left trusting Stephen Blackpool. We all believe, up at the lodge, Rachel, that he will be freed from suspicion, sooner or later. The better I know it to be so believed there, my dear," said Rachel, "and the kinder I feel it that you come away from there, purposely to comfort me, and keep me company, and be seen wi' me when I am not yet free from all suspicion myself, the more grieved I am that I should ever have spoken those mistrusting words to the young lady. And yet you don't mistrust her now, Rachel. Now that you have brought us more together, no. But I can't at all times keep out of my mind," her voice so sunk into a low and slow communing with herself, that Sissy, sitting by her side, was obliged to listen with attention. "I can't at all times keep out of my mind mistrustings of someone. I can't think who 'tis, I can't think how or why it may be done, but I mistrust that someone has put Stephen out of the way. I mistrust that by his coming back of his own accord, and showing himself innocent before them all, someone would be confounded, who, to prevent that, has stopped him, and put him out of the way." "That is a dreadful thought," said Sissy, turning pale. "It is a dreadful thought to think he may be murdered." Sissy shuddered, and turned paler yet. "When it makes its way into my mind, dear," said Rachel, "and it will come sometimes, though I do all I can to keep it out, we counting on to high numbers as I work, and saying over and over again pieces that I knew when I were a child, I fall into such a wild, hot hurry, that, however tired I am, I want to walk fast, miles and miles. I must get the better of this before bedtime. I'll walk home with you." "He might fall ill upon the journey back," said Sissy, faintly offering a worn-out scrap of hope, "and in such a case, there are many places on the road where he might stop. But he is in none of them. He has been sought for in all, and he's not there." True was Sissy's reluctant admission. He'd walk the journey in 2 days. If he was footsore and couldn't walk, I sent him, in the letter he got, the money to ride, lest he should have none of his own to spare. Let us hope that tomorrow will bring something better, Rachel. Come into the air." Her gentle hand adjusted Rachel's shawl upon her shining black hair in the usual manner of her wearing it, and they went out. The night being fine, little knots of hands were here and there lingering at street corners, but it was supper time with the greater part of them, and there were but few people in the streets. "You're not so hurried now, Rachel, and your hand is cooler." "I get better, dear, if I can only walk, and breathe a little fresh. Times when I can't, I turn weak and confused. But you must not begin to fail, Rachel, for you may be wanted at any time to stand by Stephen. Tomorrow is Saturday. If no news comes tomorrow, let us walk in the country on Sunday morning, and strengthen you for another week. Will you go?" "Yes, dear." They were by this time in the street where Mr. Bounderby's house stood. The way to Sissy's destination led them past the door, and they were going straight towards it. Some train had newly arrived in Cokertown, which had put a number of vehicles in motion, and scattered a considerable bustle about the town. Several coaches were rattling before them and behind them as they approached Mr. Bounderby's, and one of the latter drew up with such briskness as they were in the act of passing the house, that they looked round involuntarily. The bright gaslight over Mr. Bounderby's steps showed them Mrs. Sparsit in the coach, in an ecstasy of excitement, struggling to open the door. Mrs. Sparsit, seeing them at the same moment, called to them to stop. "It's a coincidence," exclaimed Mrs. Sparsit, as she was released by the coachman. "It's a providence." "Come out, then," said Mrs. Sparsit, to someone inside, "come out, or we'll have you dragged out." Hereupon, no other than the mysterious old woman descended, whom Mrs. Sparsit incontinently collared. "Leave her alone, everybody," cried Mrs. Sparsit, with great energy. "Let nobody touch her. She belongs to me." "Come in, then," said Mrs. Sparsit, reversing her former word of command. "Come in, or we'll have you dragged in." The spectacle of a matron of classical deportment, seizing an ancient woman by the throat, and hauling her into a dwelling house, would have been under any circumstances, sufficient temptation to all true English stragglers so blessed as to witness it, to force a way into that dwelling house and see the matter out. But when the phenomenon was enhanced by the notoriety and mystery by this time associated all over the town with the bank robbery, it would have lured the stragglers in, with an irresistible attraction, though the roof had been expected to fall upon their heads. Accordingly, the chance witnesses on the ground, consisting of the busiest of the neighbours to the number of some 25, closed in after Cissy and Rachel, as they closed in after Mrs. Sparsit and her prize, and the whole body made a disorderly irruption into Mr. Bounderby's dining room, where the people behind lost not a moment's time in mounting on the chairs, to get the better of the people in front. "Fetch Mr. Bounderby down," cried Mrs. Sparsit. "Rachel, young woman, you know who this is." "It's Mrs. Pgler," said Rachel. "I should think it is," cried Mrs. Sparsit, exulting. "Fetch Mr. Bounderby. Stand away, everybody." Here old Mrs. Pgler, muffling herself up, and shrinking from observation, whispered a word of entreaty. "Don't tell me," said Mrs. Sparsit, aloud. "I have told you 20 times, coming along, that I will not leave you till I have handed you over to him myself." Mr. Bounderby now appeared, accompanied by Mr. Gradgrind and the whelp, with whom he had been holding conference upstairs. Mr. Bounderby looked more astonished than hospitable, at sight of this uninvited party in his dining room. "Why, what's the matter now?" said he. "Mrs. Sparsit, Sir," explained that worthy woman, "I trust it is my good fortune to produce a person you have much desired to find. Stimulated by my wish to relieve your mind, sir, and connecting together such imperfect clues to the part of the country in which that person might be supposed to reside, as have been afforded by the young woman, Rachel, fortunately now present to identify, I have had the happiness to succeed, and to bring that person with me, I need not say most unwillingly on her part. It has not been, sir, without some trouble that I have effected this, but trouble in your service is to me a pleasure, and hunger, thirst, and cold a real gratification." Here Mrs. Sparsit ceased, for Mr. Bounderby's visage exhibited an extraordinary combination of all possible colours and expressions of discomfiture, as old Mrs. Pgler was disclosed to his view. "Why, what do you mean by this?" was his highly unexpected demand, in great warmth. "I ask you, what do you mean by this, Mrs. Sparsit?" "Sir," exclaimed Mrs. Sparsit, faintly. "Why don't you mind your own business?" roared Bounderby. "How dare you go and poke your officious nose into my family affairs?" This allusion to her favourite feature overpowered Mrs. Sparsit. She sat down stiffly in a chair, as if she were frozen, and with a fixed stare at Mr. Bounderby, slowly grated her mittens against one another, as if they were frozen too. "My dear Josiah," cried Mrs. Pgler, trembling. "My darling boy, I am not to blame. It's not my fault, Josiah. I told this lady over and over again, that I knew she was doing what would not be agreeable to you, but she would do it. What did you let her bring you for?" couldn't you knock her cap off, or her tooth out, or scratch her, or do something or other to her?" asked Bounderby. "My own boy. She threatened me that if I resisted her, I should be brought by constables, and it was better to come quietly than make that stir in such a—" Mrs. Pgler glanced timidly but proudly round the walls, "such a fine house as this. Indeed, indeed, it is not my fault. My dear, noble, stately boy. I have always lived quiet and secret, Josiah, my dear. I have never broken the condition once. I have never said I was your mother. I have admired you at a distance, and if I have come to town sometimes, with long times between, to take a proud peep at you, I have done it unbeknown, my love, and gone away again." Mr. Bounderby, with his hands in his pockets, walked in impatient mortification up and down at the side of the long dining table, while the spectators greedily took in every syllable of Mrs. Pgler's appeal, and at each succeeding syllable became more and more round-eyed. Mr. Bounderby still walking up and down when Mrs. Pgler had done, Mr. Gradgrind addressed that maligned old lady. "I am surprised, madam," he observed with severity, "that in your old age you have the face to claim Mr. Bounderby for your son, after your unnatural and inhuman treatment of him." "Me unnatural!" cried poor old Mrs. Pgler. "Me inhuman! To my dear boy!" "Dear," repeated Mr. Gradgrind. "Yes, dear in his self-made prosperity, madam, I dare say. Not very dear, however, when you deserted him in his infancy, and left him to the brutality of a drunken grandmother." "I deserted my Josiah," cried Mrs. Pgler, clasping her hands. "Now, Lord forgive you, sir, for your wicked imaginations, and for your scandal against the memory of my poor mother, who died in my arms before Josiah was born. May you repent of it, sir, and live to know better." She was so very earnest and injured, that Mr. Gradgrind, shocked by the possibility which dawned upon him, said in a gentler tone, "Do you deny, then, madam, that you left your son to be brought up in the gutter?" "Josiah in the gutter!" exclaimed Mrs. Pgler. "No such a thing, sir. Never. For shame on you. My dear boy knows, and will give you to know, that though he come of humble parents, he come of parents that loved him as dear as the best could, and never thought it hardship on themselves to pinch a bit that he might write and cipher beautiful, and I've his books at home to show it." Have I," said Mrs. Pgler, with indignant pride. "And my dear boy knows, and will give you to know, sir, that after his beloved father died, when he was 8 years old, his mother, too, could pinch a bit, as it was her duty and her pleasure and her pride to do it, to help him out in life, and put him 'prentice. And a steady lad he was, and a kind master he had to lend him a hand, and well he worked his own way forward to be rich and thriving. And I'll give you to know, sir, for this my dear boy won't, that though his mother kept but a little village shop, he never forgot her, but pensioned me on £30 a year, more than I want, for I put by out of it, only making the condition that I was to keep down in my own part, and make no boasts about him, and not trouble him. And I never have, except with looking at him once a year, when he has never knowed it. And it's right, said poor old Mrs. Pgler, in affectionate championship, that I should keep down in my own part, and I have no doubts that if I was here I should do a many unbefitting things, and I am well contented, and I can keep my pride in my Josiah to myself, and I can love for love's own sake. And I am ashamed of you, sir, said Mrs. Pgler, lastly, for your slanders and suspicions. And I never stood here before, nor never wanted to stand here when my dear son said no. And I shouldn't be here now, if it hadn't been for being brought here. And for shame upon you, oh, for shame, to accuse me of being a bad mother to my son, with my son standing here to tell you so different. The bystanders, on and off the dining-room chairs, raised a murmur of sympathy with Mrs. Pgler, and Mr. Gradgrind felt himself innocently placed in a very distressing predicament, when Mr. Bounderby, who had never ceased walking up and down, and had every moment swelled larger and larger, and grown redder and redder, stopped short. I don't exactly know, said Mr. Bounderby, how I come to be favoured with the attendance of the present company, but I don't inquire. When they are quite satisfied, perhaps they'll be so good as to disperse. Whether they are satisfied or not, perhaps they'll be so good as to disperse. I'm not bound to deliver a lecture on my family affairs, I have not undertaken to do it, and I'm not a-going to do it. Therefore those who expect any explanation whatever upon that branch of the subject, will be disappointed, particularly Tom Gradgrind, and he can't know it too soon. In reference to the bank robbery, there has been a mistake made, concerning my mother. If there hadn't been over-officiousness it wouldn't have been made, and I hate over-officiousness at all times, whether or no. Good evening. Although Mr. Bounderby carried it off in these terms, holding the door open for the company to depart, there was a blustering sheepishness upon him, at once extremely crestfallen and superlatively absurd. Detected as the bully of humility, who had built his windy reputation upon lies, and in his boastfulness had put the honest truth as far away from him as if he had advanced the mean claim, there is no meaner. To tack himself onto a pedigree, he cut a most ridiculous figure. With the people filing off at the door he held, who he knew would carry what had passed to the whole town, to be given to the four winds, he could not have looked a bully more shorn and forlorn, if he had had his ears cropped. Even that unlucky female, Mrs. Sparsit, fallen from her pinnacle of exaltation into the slough of despond, was not in so bad a plight as that remarkable man and self-made humbug, Josiah Bounderby of Cokertown. Rachel and Cissy, leaving Mrs. Pgler to occupy a bed at her son's for that night, walked together to the gate of Stone Lodge and there parted. Mr. Gradgrind joined them before they had gone very far, and spoke with much interest of Stephen Blackpool, for whom he thought this signal failure of the suspicions against Mrs. Pgler was likely to work well. As to the whelp, throughout this scene as on all other late occasions, he had stuck close to Bounderby. He seemed to feel that as long as Bounderby could make no discovery without his knowledge, he was so far safe. He never visited his sister, and had only seen her once since she went home, that is to say on the night when he still stuck close to Bounderby, as already related. There was one dim unformed fear lingering about his sister's mind, to which she never gave utterance, which surrounded the graceless and ungrateful boy with a dreadful mystery. The same dark possibility had presented itself in the same shapeless guise, this very day, to Sissy, when Rachel spoke of someone who would be confounded by Stephen's return, having put him out of the way. Louisa had never spoken of harboring any suspicion of her brother in connection with the robbery. She and Sissy had held no confidence on the subject, save in that one interchange of looks when the unconscious father rested his grey head on his hand, but it was understood between them, and they both knew it. This other fear was so awful, that it hovered about each of them like a ghostly shadow, neither daring to think of its being near herself, far less of its being near the other. And still the forced spirit which the whelp had plucked up, throve with him. If Stephen Blackpool was not the thief, let him show himself. Why didn't he? Another night. Another day and night. No Stephen Blackpool. Where was the man, and why did he not come back? Chapter 6. The starlight. The Sunday was a bright Sunday in autumn, clear and cool, when early in the morning Sissy and Rachel met, to walk in the country. As Coketown cast ashes not only on its own head but on the neighbourhood's too, after the manner of those pious persons who do penance for their own sins by putting other people into sackcloth, it was customary for those who now and then thirsted for a draught of pure air, which is not absolutely the most wicked among the vanities of life, to get a few miles away by the railroad, and then begin their walk, or their lounge in the fields. Sissy and Rachel helped themselves out of the smoke by the usual means, and were put down at a station about midway between the town and Mr. Bounderby's retreat. Though the green landscape was blotted here and there with heaps of coal, it was green elsewhere, and there were trees to see, and there were larks singing, though it was Sunday, and there were pleasant scents in the air, and all was overarched by a bright blue sky. In the distance one way, Coketown showed as a black mist, in another distance hills began to rise, in a third, there was a faint change in the light of the horizon where it shone upon the far-off sea. Under their feet, the grass was fresh. Beautiful shadows of branches flickered upon it, and speckled it, hedgerows were luxuriant, everything was at peace. Engines at pits' mouths, and lean old horses that had worn the circle of their daily labor into the ground, were alike quiet, wheels had ceased for a short space to turn, and the great wheel of earth seemed to revolve without the shocks and noises of another time. They walked on across the fields and down the shady lanes, sometimes getting over a fragment of a fence so rotten that it dropped at a touch of the foot, sometimes passing near a wreck of bricks and beams overgrown with grass, marking the site of deserted works. They followed paths and tracks, however slight. Mounds where the grass was rank and high, and where brambles, dockweed, and such like vegetation, were confusedly heaped together, they always avoided, for dismal stories were told in that country of the old pits hidden beneath such indications. The sun was high when they sat down to rest. They had seen no one, near or distant, for a long time, and the solitude remained unbroken. "It is so still here, Rachel, and the way is so untrodden, that I think we must be the first who have been here all the summer." As Sissy said it, her eyes were attracted by another of those rotten fragments of fence upon the ground. She got up to look at it. "And yet I don't know. This has not been broken very long. The wood is quite fresh where it gave way. Here are footsteps too. Oh, Rachel!" She ran back, and caught her round the neck. Rachel had already started up. "What is the matter?" "I don't know. There is a hat lying in the grass." They went forward together. Rachel took it up, shaking from head to foot. She broke into a passion of tears and lamentations. Stephen Blackpool was written in his own hand on the inside. "Oh, the poor lad, the poor lad! He has been made away with. He is lying murdered here. Has the hat any blood upon it?" Sissy faltered. They were afraid to look, but they did examine it, and found no mark of violence, inside or out. It had been lying there some days, for rain and dew had stained it, and the mark of its shape was on the grass where it had fallen. They looked fearfully about them, without moving, but could see nothing more. "Rachel," Sissy whispered, "I will go on a little by myself." She had unclasped her hand, and was in the act of stepping forward, when Rachel caught her in both arms with a scream that resounded over the wide landscape. Before them, at their very feet, was the brink of a black ragged chasm hidden by the thick grass. They sprang back, and fell upon their knees, each hiding her face upon the other's neck. "Oh, my good Lord! He's down there! Down there!" At first this, and her terrific screams, were all that could be got from Rachel, by any tears, by any prayers, by any representations, by any means. It was impossible to hush her, and it was deadly necessary to hold her, or she would have flung herself down the shaft. "Rachel, dear Rachel, good Rachel, for the love of heaven, not these dreadful cries. Think of Stephen, think of Stephen, think of Stephen." By an earnest repetition of this entreaty, poured out in all the agony of such a moment, Sissy at last brought her to be silent, and to look at her with a tearless face of stone. "Rachel, Stephen may be living. You wouldn't leave him lying maimed at the bottom of this dreadful place, a moment, if you could bring help to him. No, no, no. Don't stir from here, for his sake. Let me go and listen." She shuddered to approach the pit, but she crept towards it on her hands and knees, and called to him as loud as she could call. She listened, but no sound replied. She called again and listened, still no answering sound. She did this 20, 30 times. She took a little clod of earth from the broken ground where he had stumbled, and threw it in. She could not hear it fall. The wide prospect, so beautiful in its stillness but a few minutes ago, almost carried despair to her brave heart, as she rose and looked all round her, seeing no help. "Rachel, we must lose not a moment. We must go in different directions, seeking aid. You shall go by the way we have come, and I will go forward by the path. Tell anyone you see, and everyone what has happened. Think of Stephen, think of Stephen. She knew by Rachel's face that she might trust her now. And after standing for a moment to see her running, wringing her hands as she ran, she turned and went upon her own search. She stopped at the hedge to tie her shawl there as a guide to the place, then threw her bonnet aside, and ran as she had never run before. Run, Sissy, run, in heaven's name. Don't stop for breath. Run, run. Quickening herself by carrying such entreaties in her thoughts, she ran from field to field, and lane to lane, and place to place, as she had never run before, until she came to a shed by an engine house, where two men lay in the shade, asleep on straw. First to wake them, and next to tell them, all so wild and breathless as she was, what had brought her there, were difficulties, but they no sooner understood her than their spirits were on fire like hers. One of the men was in a drunken slumber, but on his comrades shouting to him that a man had fallen down the old hell shaft, he started out to a pool of dirty water, put his head in it, and came back sober. With these two men she ran to another half a mile further, and with that one to another, while they ran elsewhere. Then a horse was found, and she got another man to ride for life or death to the railroad, and send a message to Louisa, which she wrote and gave him. By this time a whole village was up, and windlasses, ropes, poles, candles, lanterns, all things necessary, were fast collecting and being brought into one place, to be carried to the old hell shaft. It seemed now hours and hours since she had left the lost man lying in the grave where he had been buried alive. She could not bear to remain away from it any longer. It was like deserting him, and she hurried swiftly back, accompanied by half a dozen laborers, including the drunken man whom the news had sobered, and who was the best man of all. When they came to the old hell shaft, they found it as lonely as she had left it. The men called and listened as she had done, and examined the edge of the chasm, and settled how it had happened, and then sat down to wait until the implements they wanted should come up. Every sound of insects in the air, every stirring of the leaves, every whisper among these men, made Sissy tremble, for she thought it was a cry at the bottom of the pit. But the wind blew idly over it, and no sound arose to the surface, and they sat upon the grass, waiting and waiting. After they had waited some time, straggling people who had heard of the accident began to come up. Then the real help of implements began to arrive. In the midst of this, Rachel returned, and with her party there was a surgeon, who brought some wine and medicines. But the expectation among the people that the man would be found alive was very slight indeed. There being now people enough present to impede the work, the sobered man put himself at the head of the rest, or was put there by the general consent, and made a large ring round the old hell shaft, and appointed men to keep it. Besides such volunteers as were accepted to work, only Sissy and Rachel were at first permitted within this ring, but, later in the day, when the message brought an express from Coketown. Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa, and Mr. Bounderby, and the whelp, were also there. The sun was 4 hours lower than when Sissy and Rachel had first sat down upon the grass, before a means of enabling 2 men to descend securely was rigged with poles and ropes. Difficulties had arisen in the construction of this machine. Simple as it was, requisites had been found wanting, and messages had had to go and return. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the bright autumnal Sunday, before a candle was sent down to try the air, while 3 or 4 rough faces stood crowded close together, attentively watching it, the man at the windlass lowering as they were told. The candle was brought up again, feebly burning, and then some water was cast in. Then the bucket was hooked on, and the sobered man and another got in with lights, giving the word lower away. As the rope went out, tight and strained, and the windlass creaked, there was not a breath among the 100 or 200 men and women looking on, that came as it was wont to come. The signal was given and the windlass stopped, with abundant rope to spare. Apparently so long an interval ensued with the men at the windlass standing idle, that some women shrieked that another accident had happened. But the surgeon who held the watch, declared 5 minutes not to have elapsed yet, and sternly admonished them to keep silence. He had not well done speaking, when the windlass was reversed and worked again. Practiced eyes knew that it did not go as heavily as it would if both workmen had been coming up, and that only one was returning. The rope came in tight and strained, and ring after ring was coiled upon the barrel of the windlass, and all eyes were fastened on the pit. The sobered man was brought up and leaped out briskly on the grass. There was an universal cry of alive or dead, and then a deep, profound hush. When he said alive, a great shout arose and many eyes had tears in them. But he's hurt very bad, he added, as soon as he could make himself heard again. Where's doctor? He's hurt so very bad, sir, that we don't know how to get him up. They all consulted together, and looked anxiously at the surgeon, as he asked some questions, and shook his head on receiving the replies. The sun was setting now, and the red light in the evening sky touched every face there, and caused it to be distinctly seen in all its rapt suspense. The consultation ended in the men returning to the windlass, and the pitman going down again, carrying the wine and some other small matters with him. Then the other man came up. In the meantime, under the surgeon's directions, some men brought a hurdle, on which others made a thick bed of spare clothes covered with loose straw, while he himself contrived some bandages and slings from shawls and handkerchiefs. As these were made, they were hung upon an arm of the pitman who had last come up, with instructions how to use them, and as he stood, shown by the light he carried, leaning his powerful loose hand upon one of the poles, and sometimes glancing down the pit, and sometimes glancing round upon the people, he was not the least conspicuous figure in the scene. It was dark now, and torches were kindled. It appeared from the little this man said to those about him, which was quickly repeated all over the circle, that the lost man had fallen upon a mass of crumbled rubbish with which the pit was half choked up, and that his fall had been further broken by some jagged earth at the side. He lay upon his back with one arm doubled under him, and according to his own belief had hardly stirred since he fell, except that he had moved his free hand to a side pocket, in which he remembered to have some bread and meat, of which he had swallowed crumbs, and had likewise scooped up a little water in it now and then. He had come straight away from his work, on being written to, and had walked the whole journey, and was on his way to Mr. Bounderby's country house after dark, when he fell. He was crossing that dangerous country at such a dangerous time, because he was innocent of what was laid to his charge, and couldn't rest from coming the nearest way to deliver himself up. The old hell shaft, the pitman said, with a curse upon it, was worthy of its bad name to the last, for though Stephen could speak now, he believed it would soon be found to have mangled the life out of him. When all was ready, this man, still taking his last hurried charges from his comrades and the surgeon after the windlass had begun to lower him, disappeared into the pit. The rope went out as before, the signal was made as before, and the windlass stopped. No man removed his hand from it now. Every one waited with his grasp set, and his body bent down to the work, ready to reverse and wind in. At length the signal was given, and all the ring leaned forward. For, now, the rope came in, tightened and strained to its utmost as it appeared, and the men turned heavily, and the windlass complained. It was scarcely endurable to look at the rope, and think of its giving way. But, ring after ring was coiled upon the barrel of the windlass safely, and the connecting chains appeared, and finally the bucket with the two men holding on at the sides, a sight to make the head swim, and oppress the heart, and tenderly supporting between them, slung and tied within, the figure of a poor, crushed, human creature. A low murmur of pity went round the throng, and the women wept aloud, as this form, almost without form, was moved very slowly from its iron deliverance, and laid upon the bed of straw. At first, none but the surgeon went close to it. He did what he could in its adjustment on the couch, but the best that he could do was to cover it. That gently done, he called to him Rachel and Sissy. And at that time the pale, worn, patient face was seen looking up at the sky, with the broken right hand lying bare on the outside of the covering garments, as if waiting to be taken by another hand. They gave him drink, moistened his face with water, and administered some drops of cordial and wine. Though he lay quite motionless looking up at the sky, he smiled and said, "Rachel." She stooped down on the grass at his side, and bent over him until her eyes were between his and the sky, for he could not so much as turn them to look at her. "Rachel, my dear." She took his hand. He smiled again and said, "Don't let T go. Thou art in great pain, my own dear Stephen." "I ha' been, but not now. I ha' been, dreadful, and dree, and long, my dear, but 'tis o'er now. Ah, Rachel, or a muddle. Fro first to last, a muddle." The spectre of his old look seemed to pass as he said the word. "I ha' fell into th pit, my dear, as have cost we in the knowledge o' old folk now living, hundreds and hundreds o' men's lives, fathers, sons, brothers, dear to thousands and thousands, and keeping 'em fro want and hunger. I fell into a pit that been we fire damp crueler than battle. I read on in the public petition, as ony one may read, fro the men that works in pits, in which they prayen and prayen the lawmakers for Christ's sake not to let their work be murder to 'em, but to spare 'em for wives and children that they loves as well as gentlefolk loves theirs. When it were in work, it killed without need, when 'tis let alone, it kills without need. See how we die and no need, one way and another, in a muddle, every day. He faintly said it, without any anger against any one. Merely as the truth. Thy little sister, Rachel, thou hast not forgot her. Thou art not like to forget her now, and me so nigh her. Thou knowest, poor, patient, suffering, dear, how thou didst work for her, seaten all day long in her little chair at thy window, and how she died, young and misshapen, alling o' sickly air as had no need to be, and alling o' working people's miserable homes. A muddle. Or a muddle. Louisa approached him, but he could not see her, lying with his face turned up to the night sky. If aught things that touches us, my dear, was not so muddled, I should had need to come here. If we was not in a muddle among ourselves, I should been, by my own fellow weavers and working brothers, so mistook. If Mr. Bounderby had ever knowed me right, if he'd ever knowed me at all, he would took offence wi' me. He would suspect me. But look up yonder, Rachel. Look above. Following his eyes, she saw that he was gazing at a star. Stephen Blackpool recovered from the old hell shaft it shined upon me, he said reverently, in my pain and trouble down below. It shined into my mind. I look at thee and thought o' thee, Rachel, till the muddle in my mind have cleared above a bit, I hope. If some been wanting in understanding me better, I, too, been wanting in understanding them better. When I got thy letter, I easily believen that what the young lady sen and done to me, and what her brother sen and done to me, was one, and that there were a wicked plot betwixt 'em. When I fell, I were in anger wi' her, and hurrying on be as unjust her as others was me. But in our judgments, like as in our doings, we mun bear and forbear. In my pain and trouble, looking up yonder, it shining on me, I seen more clear, and made it my dying prayer that world may ony come together more, and get a better understanding o' one another, than when I were in my own weak cell. Louisa, hearing what he said, bent over him on the opposite side to Rachel, so that he could see her. You heard, he said, after a few moments' silence. I not forgot you, Lady. Yes, Stephen, I have heard you. And your prayer is mine. You a father. Will you take a message to him? He is here, said Louisa, with dread. Shall I bring him to you? If you please. Louisa returned with her father. Standing hand in hand, they both looked down upon the solemn countenance. "Sir, yo will clear me and make my name good wi' all men. This I leave to yo." Mr. Gradgrind was troubled and asked how. "Sir," was the reply, "your son will tell yo how. Ask him. I make no charges, I leave none ahint me, not a single word. I ha seen and spoken wi' your son, one night. I ask no more o' yo than that yo clear me, and I trust to yo to duty." The bearers being now ready to carry him away, and the surgeon being anxious for his removal, those who had torches or lanterns prepared to go in front of the litter. Before it was raised, and while they were arranging how to go, he said to Rachel, looking upward at the star, "Often as I come to mysel, and found it shinin' on me down there in my trouble, I thought it were the star as guided to our Saviour's home. I almost think it be the very star." They lifted him up, and he was overjoyed to find that they were about to take him in the direction whither the star seemed to him to lead. "Rachel, beloved lass, don't let go my hand. We may walk together to-night, my dear. I will hold thy hand, and keep beside thee, Stephen, all the way. Bless thee. Will somebody be pleased to cover my face?" They carried him very gently along the fields, and down the lanes, and over the wide landscape, Rachel always holding the hand in hers. Very few whispers broke the mournful silence. It was soon a funeral procession. The star had shown him where to find the God of the poor, and through humility, and sorrow, and forgiveness, he had gone to his Redeemer's rest. Chapter 7 Whelp hunting. Before the ring formed round the old hell shaft was broken, one figure had disappeared from within it. Mr. Bounderby and his shadow had not stood near Louisa, who held her father's arm, but in a retired place by themselves. When Mr. Gradgrind was summoned to the couch, Sissy, attentive to all that happened, slipped behind that wicked shadow, a sight in the horror of his face, if there had been eyes there for any sight but one, and whispered in his ear. Without turning his head, he conferred with her a few moments, and vanished. Thus the whelp had gone out of the circle before the people moved. When the father reached home, he sent a message to Mr. Bounderby's, desiring his son to come to him directly. The reply was, that Mr. Bounderby, having missed him in the crowd, and seeing nothing of him since, had supposed him to be at Stone Lodge. "I believe, father," said Louisa, "he will not come back to town tonight." Mr. Gradgrind turned away, and said no more. In the morning, he went down to the bank himself as soon as it was opened, and seeing his son's place empty, he had not the courage to look in at first, went back along the street to meet Mr. Bounderby on his way there, to whom he said that, for reasons he would soon explain, but entreated not then to be asked for, he had found it necessary to employ his son at a distance for a little while. Also, that he was charged with the duty of vindicating Stephen Blackpool's memory, and declaring the thief. Mr. Bounderby, quite confounded, stood stock-still in the street after his father-in-law had left him, swelling like an immense soap bubble, without its beauty. Mr. Gradgrind went home, locked himself in his room, and kept it all that day. When Sissy and Louisa tapped at his door, he said, without opening it, "Not now, my dears, in the evening." On their return in the evening, he said, "I am not able yet, tomorrow." He ate nothing all day, and had no candle after dark, and they heard him walking to and fro late at night. But, in the morning he appeared at breakfast at the usual hour, and took his usual place at the table. Aged and bent he looked, and quite bowed down, and yet he looked a wiser man, and a better man, than in the days when in this life he wanted nothing but facts. Before he left the room, he appointed a time for them to come to him, and so, with his grey head drooping, went away. "Dear father," said Louisa, when they kept their appointment, "you have 3 young children left. They will be different, I will be different yet, with heaven's help." She gave her hand to Sissy, as if she meant with her help too. "Your wretched brother," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Do you think he had planned this robbery, when he went with you to the lodging?" "I fear so, father. I know he had wanted money very much, and had spent a great deal. The poor man being about to leave the town, it came into his evil brain to cast suspicion on him. I think it must have flashed upon him while he sat there, father. For I asked him to go there with me. The visit did not originate with him. He had some conversation with the poor man." "Did he take him aside?" "He took him out of the room. I asked him afterwards why he had done so, and he made a plausible excuse, but since last night, father, and when I remember the circumstances by its light, I am afraid I can imagine too truly what passed between them." "Let me know," said her father, "if your thoughts present your guilty brother in the same dark view as mine." "I fear, father," hesitated Louisa, "that he must have made some representation to Stephen Blackpool, perhaps in my name, perhaps in his own, which induced him to do in good faith and honesty, what he had never done before, and to wait about the bank those 2 or 3 nights before he left the town." "Too plain," returned the father. "Too plain." He shaded his face, and remained silent for some moments. Recovering himself, he said, "And now, how is he to be found? How is he to be saved from justice? In the few hours that I can possibly allow to elapse before I publish the truth, how is he to be found by us, and only by us? £10,000 could not effect it." "Sissy has effected it, father." He raised his eyes to where she stood, like a good fairy in his house, and said in a tone of softened gratitude and grateful kindness, "It is always you, my child." "We had our fears," Sissy explained, glancing at Louisa, "before yesterday, and when I saw you brought to the side of the litter last night, and heard what passed, being close to Rachel all the time, I went to him when no one saw, and said to him, 'Don't look at me. See where your father is. Escape at once, for his sake and your own.' He was in a tremble before I whispered to him, and he started and trembled more then, and said, 'Where can I go? I have very little money, and I don't know who will hide me. I thought of father's old circus. I have not forgotten where Mr. Sleary goes at this time of year, and I read of him in a paper only the other day. I told him to hurry there, and tell his name, and ask Mr. Sleary to hide him till I came. I'll get to him before the morning, he said. And I saw him shrink away among the people. Thank heaven, exclaimed his father. He may be got abroad yet. It was the more hopeful as the town to which Cissy had directed him was within 3 hours' journey of Liverpool, whence he could be swiftly dispatched to any part of the world. But, caution being necessary in communicating with him, for there was a greater danger every moment of his being suspected now, and nobody could be sure at heart but that Mr. Bounderby himself, in a bullying vein of public zeal, might play a Roman part, it was consented that Cissy and Louisa should repair to the place in question, by a circuitous course, alone, and that the unhappy father, setting forth in an opposite direction, should get round to the same bourne by another and wider route. It was further agreed that he should not present himself to Mr. Sleary, lest his intentions should be mistrusted, or the intelligence of his arrival should cause his son to take flight anew, but that the communication should be left to Cissy and Louisa to open, and that they should inform the cause of so much misery and disgrace, of his father's being at hand and of the purpose for which they had come. When these arrangements had been well considered and were fully understood by all three, it was time to begin to carry them into execution. Early in the afternoon, Mr. Gradgrind walked direct from his own house into the country, to be taken up on the line by which he was to travel, and at night the remaining two set forth upon their different course, encouraged by not seeing any face they knew. The two travelled all night, except when they were left, for odd numbers of minutes, at branch places, up illimitable flights of steps, or down wells, which was the only variety of those branches, and, early in the morning, were turned out on a swamp, a mile or two from the town they sought. From this dismal spot they were rescued by a savage old postilion, who happened to be up early, kicking a horse in a fly, and so were smuggled into the town by all the back lanes where the pigs lived, which, although not a magnificent or even savoury approach, was, as is usual in such cases, the legitimate highway. The first thing they saw on entering the town was the skeleton of Sleary's circus. The company had departed for another town more than 20 miles off, and had opened there last night. The connection between the two places was by a hilly turnpike road, and the travelling on that road was very slow. Though they took but a hasty breakfast, and no rest, which it would have been in vain to seek under such anxious circumstances, it was noon before they began to find the bills of Sleary's horse riding on barns and walls, and 1 o'clock when they stopped in the market-place. A grand morning performance by the riders, commencing at that very hour, was in course of announcement by the bellman as they set their feet upon the stones of the street. Cissy recommended that, to avoid making inquiries and attracting attention in the town, they should present themselves to pay at the door. If Mr. Sleary were taking the money, he would be sure to know her, and would proceed with discretion. If he were not, he would be sure to see them inside, and, knowing what he had done with the fugitive, would proceed with discretion still. Therefore, they repaired, with fluttering hearts, to the well-remembered booth. The flag with the inscription Sleary's horse riding was there, and the Gothic niche was there, but Mr. Sleary was not there. Master Kidderminster, grown too maturely turfy to be received by the wildest credulity as Cupid any more, had yielded to the invincible force of circumstances, and his beard, and, in the capacity of a man who made himself generally useful, presided on this occasion over the exchequer, having also a drum in reserve, on which to expend his leisure moments and superfluous forces. In the extreme sharpness of his look-out for base coin, Mr. Kidderminster, as at present situated, never saw anything but money, so Sissy passed him unrecognized, and they went in. The Emperor of Japan, on a steady old white horse stenciled with black spots, was twirling 5 wash-hand basins at once, as it is the favorite recreation of that monarch to do. Sissy, though well acquainted with his royal line, had no personal knowledge of the present emperor, and his reign was peaceful. Miss Josephine Sleary, in her celebrated graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act, was then announced by a new clown, who humorously said cauliflower act, and Mr. Sleary appeared, leading her in. Mr. Sleary had only made one cut at the clown with his long whiplash, and the clown had only said, "If you do it again, I'll throw the horse at you," when Sissy was recognized both by father and daughter. But they got through the act with great self-possession, and Mr. Sleary, saving for the first instant, conveyed no more expression into his locomotive eye than into his fixed one. The performance seemed a little long to Sissy and Louisa, particularly when it stopped to afford the clown an opportunity of telling Mr. Sleary, who said indeed, "Sir," to all his observations in the calmest way, and with his eye on the house, about 2 legs sitting on 3 legs looking at 1 leg, when in came 4 legs, and laid hold on leg, and up got